In the glittering halls of Madrid's Alcazar Palace in the spring of 1661, bells rang out across the city, heralding the birth of a long-awaited heir. But this fragile prince, born to a 60-year-old king and his much younger niece, carried the weight of a dynasty's darkest secret. Generations of royal inbreeding that threatened to unravel an empire. What if the very blood meant to preserve power was poisoning it from within? Dive into the tragic tale of Charles II, the bewitched king, and ask yourself, would you defy centuries of tradition to save a bloodline, or let fate decide? The Alcazar Palace of Madrid shimmered under the spring sun of 1661. Bells tolled throughout the city, announcing the birth of the long-awaited heir. Philip IV, aged 60, with his face marked by the characteristic Habsburg prognathism, gazed at his newborn son with a mix of relief and worry. Little Charles had arrived after years of prayers and pleas, the fruit of his marriage to Mariana of Austria, his niece, 30 years his junior. "Your Majesty, the prince is breathing with difficulty," whispered the midwife, holding the fragile baby with his disproportionately large head. Philip IV nodded gravely. As monarch of the world's most extensive empire, he knew the dynasty's survival depended on this child. Yet he was also aware of the price the Habsburgs had been paying for generations due to their matrimonial policy. "Summon the court physician," ordered the king, knowing that this heir, conceived when hope was nearly lost, bore the burden of 2 centuries of consanguineous unions. In the royal antechamber, Catalina de Mendoza, a young lady of the court newly arrived from the provinces, observed the scene with curiosity. Descended from a noble family but a minor branch, Catalina had been selected to serve Queen Mariana. Her beauty and sharp intelligence contrasted with the atmosphere of decadence that permeated the palace. "It is divine will," murmured beside her Doña Teresa de Velasco, an elderly lady-in-waiting who had served 3 generations of Habsburg queens. Kings must marry among themselves to maintain the purity of royal blood. Catalina frowned, recalling her father's teachings, a physician educated in Italy who had dared to question such practices. "My father says that blood does not purify, but corrupts when close relatives wed." The elderly woman looked at her in alarm and abruptly pulled her away from the group. "Guard your words, girl. Such opinions could be considered heresy at court. Do you question the wisdom that has kept the empire united for centuries?" While the ladies discussed in low voices, the royal physician, Don Francisco de Herrera, examined the prince. He had attended enough royal infants to recognize the signs. Little Charles already showed the prominent chin characteristic of the Habsburgs, but also displayed worrying symptoms: difficulty suckling, weak limbs, and an abnormally soft cry. "Your Majesty," said the physician, bowing before Philip IV, "the prince will need special care. I recommend he remain with wet nurses until he shows greater strength." The king nodded with resignation. It was not the first time he had heard such warnings. Of his numerous children, with different wives and mistresses, many had died in infancy. The ghost of inbreeding haunted the House of Austria for generations, but political necessity had always prevailed over medical warnings. That night, while the palace celebrated the heir's birth, Catalina found Dr. Herrera alone in the royal library, consulting ancient medical treatises. "Excuse the intrusion, doctor," murmured the young woman. "I couldn't help noticing your concern for the prince's condition." The physician looked at her in surprise, but recognized in her an uncommon intelligence. "The prince's health is a matter of state, miss. My father is a physician in Toledo," continued Catalina. "He has studied how diseases are transmitted in families and how marriages between relatives increase certain ailments." Herrera closed the book he was consulting and looked around to ensure they were alone. "Your father is a wise and brave man. The Habsburgs have paid a high price for their matrimonial policy. What you see today is the result of nearly 2 centuries of inbreeding." He stood and pulled a heavy genealogy book from a shelf. He opened it, showing the family tree of the dynasty. "Observe, Philip and Mariana share not one, but multiple common ancestors. Charles VIII married his cousin Isabel of Portugal. Their son Philip II married 4 times, including his niece Anna of Austria. Philip III wed his cousin Margaret of Austria. It's like a circle that narrows, murmured Catalina, tracing with her finger the lines connecting the same ancestors again and again. Exactly, nodded Herrera. With each generation, the blood has become more concentrated. The current king has a high coefficient of consanguinity, but his son, our Prince Charles, presents levels never seen before, almost as if he were the child of siblings. And what are the consequences? Asked Catalina, though deep down she already knew the answer. You are seeing them. The mandibular prognathism that characterizes the family has intensified generation after generation. King Philip IV's jaw is more pronounced than his father's, and I fear the little prince will have it even more prominent. But there are graver consequences: physical weakness, susceptibility to diseases, difficulties speaking, walking, and begetting heirs. Catalina understood the true state concern. The physician nodded gravely. That is the greatest fear. If Prince Charles cannot continue the line, 2 centuries of Habsburg dominance could end with him. At that moment, they heard footsteps in the corridor. Herrera quickly closed the book and returned it to its place. Be careful, Catalina. Knowledge can be dangerous at court. There are those who would consider your questions as a challenge to the divine will that placed the Habsburgs on the throne. Imagine discovering a family secret so toxic it could topple an empire. Would you speak out, risking everything, or stay silent like Catalina initially did? Over the following years, Catalina watched with growing concern the development of Prince Charles. At age 4, he still did not walk or speak properly. His head seemed too large for his weak body, and his pronounced prognathism made feeding difficult. Courtiers whispered behind his back, and foreign ambassadors sent worrying reports to their countries. In 1665, Philip IV died, leaving as heir a 4-year-old child who could barely stand. Queen Mariana assumed the regency, and the court divided into factions vying for control of the weakened empire. Catalina, who had gained the queen's trust through her loyalty and discretion, frequently attended meetings of the royal council. One day, the English ambassador requested a private audience with the regent. "Your Majesty," said the diplomat with careful courtesy, "my sovereign Charles II of England proposes a matrimonial alliance between our royal houses. An English princess could bring fresh blood to the Spanish line of succession." Queen Mariana looked at him coldly. "We appreciate the proposal, but the tradition of our house has always been to seek alliances within the Habsburg family. My son will marry an Austrian princess of blood when the time comes." After the ambassador's departure, Catalina could not contain herself. "Majesty, forgive my boldness, but perhaps a union outside the family could strengthen the health of the royal lineage." The queen looked at her in surprise. "You question centuries of tradition. The greatness of our dynasty has been built by maintaining the purity of our blood. But, Majesty, the prince needs to grow stronger. New ties could bring vigor to the succession line." The queen remained silent for a moment, contemplating her lady-in-waiting. "I understand your concern, Catalina, but there are forces greater than the health of a single individual. The empire depends on our traditional alliances." Meanwhile, in the dark corners of the palace, young Prince Charles grew surrounded by superstitions and fears. His physical weakness and learning difficulties fueled rumors that he was bewitched. Courtiers whispered that his condition was not the result of inbreeding, but of some curse or witchcraft. One night, Catalina found the prince, now 10 years old, alone in the family portrait gallery. The child contemplated the face of his great-grandfather Philip II, seeking similarities with his own reflection in a mirror he held in his hand. "Highness, it is late to be awake," said Catalina gently. "Everyone says I am bewitched," murmured the prince with difficulty due to his pronounced jaw. "But look, I have the same face as my grandfather and my great-grandfather and all before them." Catalina felt her heart constrict. "You are not bewitched, Highness. You carry the legacy of your family in your face, in your blood. Why can't I run like other children? Why is it so hard for me to learn my lessons?" Catalina chose her words carefully. "Every family has its own characteristics, Highness. Yours has ruled half the world for centuries, but that power has come with certain sacrifices. The young prince looked at her with eyes reflecting an intelligence greater than many attributed to him. Sacrifices like always marrying among ourselves, right? I've heard the physicians when they think I don't understand. In that moment, Catalina made a decision. This child, heir to the world's greatest empire, deserved to know the truth about his condition. It was not a spell that afflicted him, but the result of generations of political decisions that had placed dynastic power above biological health. Highness, your blood is ancient and noble, but when the same blood mixes with itself too many times, it can lose its strength. Like when wine ferments too long and turns to vinegar. The prince nodded, understanding the analogy. And there's no remedy? There is, Highness. When you are king, you will have the opportunity to make different decisions from your ancestors. You could seek a queen outside the family, bring new blood to the lineage. The prince's eyes lit up with a hope Catalina had not seen before. Then, when I am king, I will break the spell. It is not a spell, Highness. It is simply nature reminding us that all human beings, even kings, are subject to its laws. As she accompanied the young prince back to his chambers, Catalina felt the weight of history on her shoulders. The future of Spain and much of Europe would depend on whether this fragile child managed to survive. And more importantly, if he understood that the true poisoned legacy of the Habsburgs was not a supernatural curse, but the result of generations of courtly inbreeding that had fermented flesh and reason to the limits of endurance. What if you were in Catalina's position, whispering forbidden truths to a vulnerable heir? Would you risk it to spark change or fear the consequences? Madrid, 1679. The royal palace buzzed with activity as preparations were finalized for the wedding of King Charles II to Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of the powerful Louis XIII of France. At his age, Charles remained a weak and sickly young man, but he had survived against all odds and now prepared to fulfill his most important duty, begetting an heir to ensure the dynasty's continuity. Catalina de Mendoza, now chief chamberlain of the royal household, supervised the preparations with efficiency, though her heart harbored doubts about the future of this union. For the first time in generations, a Spanish Habsburg was marrying outside the close family circle, but Catalina feared the damage from 2 centuries of inbreeding was already irreversible. Doña Catalina called the Duke of Medina Telly, the kingdom's prime minister. His Majesty requests your presence in his chambers. When Catalina entered the royal chamber, she found Charles seated by the window. Despite his youth, his appearance was that of an older man, pale, with the characteristic Habsburg prominent chin so accentuated that it hindered his speech, and a general fragility that contrasted with the portrait of his father dominating the room. Catalina, said the king with his nasal voice, you have been my most faithful companion since childhood. I need your honest advice. I am at your service, Majesty. Do you think I will be able to fulfill my duty as a husband? The courtiers murmur that I am incapable of begetting an heir. The question caught her by surprise, but Catalina had learned to be direct with the monarch. Majesty, no one can know for certain. What matters is that you try to lead a healthy life and that your wife is strong. Marie-Louise is young and vigorous. Charles nodded. And she comes from outside our family, as you advised me years ago. Catalina recalled that conversation in the portrait gallery. It is a step in the right direction, Majesty. But perhaps it is too late, murmured the king, looking at his trembling hands. The French physician who examined my reports said I am a poor, exhausted prince in body and perhaps in mind. It is because of the blood, Catalina, what you told me about my ancestors marrying among themselves. Medical science does not have all the answers, Majesty, but we know that when close relatives unite generation after generation, certain weaknesses can magnify. Charles stood with effort and approached the mirror. His reflection showed a face where the mandibular prognathism had intensified to extreme limits, with a lower jaw protruding so much that his rows of teeth did not meet. My great-grandfather, Philip II, already had this chin, reflected the king, but in me it is monstrous. "It is not monstrous, Majesty. It is the seal of your noble house." "A seal that could also be our sentence," responded Charles with bitterness. "Sometimes, when I walk the palace halls among the portraits of my ancestors, I feel they watch me with pity, as if they know that in me ends what they began." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the royal confessor, who announced it was time for the daily prayer session for the monarch's fertility. Catalina withdrew, aware that the empire's hopes rested on shoulders too weak to bear them. The days before the wedding passed amid rituals and ceremonies. The Spanish court, known for its rigid protocol, subjected Charles to endless public acts that exhausted his scant strength. Catalina watched with concern as the monarch struggled to maintain composure, while foreign ambassadors examined him with barely disguised curiosity. The French ambassador in particular sent detailed reports to Versailles about the Spanish king's health. "His body is as weak as his mind," he wrote. "He walks like a 4-year-old child, and his speech is barely comprehensible due to his mandibular deformity. I doubt he can consummate the marriage or beget heirs." News of these reports reached Catalina's ears through her contacts in the French court. She then understood that the marriage to Marie-Louise was not just an alliance, but a strategy by Louis XIV to ensure the Spanish Habsburg line ended with Charles, opening the door to French claims on the Spanish throne. The night before the wedding, Catalina found Charles in the royal chapel, praying alone before the altar. "Majesty, you should rest. Tomorrow will be an important day." "I cannot sleep, Catalina. The weight of the crown, the empire, the dynasty. Sometimes I feel it crushes me." "You have borne that weight since you were a child, Majesty, and you have shown more strength than many attribute to you." Charles smiled weakly. "My mother always said the problem was a spell, that someone had bewitched our family. She even allowed those humiliating exorcisms." "Superstitions are sometimes more comfortable than scientific truths, Majesty." "The truth," sighed Charles, "is that we are victims of our own arrogance. We believed we could defy the laws of nature by marrying among ourselves, generation after generation, preserving pure blood. And now look at me, the final result of that experiment." Catalina observed the king with a mix of compassion and admiration. Despite his physical and intellectual limitations, Charles showed moments of surprising lucidity. Picture yourself as Charles on the eve of a politically charged marriage, knowing your body's failings could doom an empire. Would you cling to hope, or confront the harsh reality as he did? The wedding was celebrated with all the pomp the deteriorated Spanish treasury could muster. Marie-Louise of Orléans, beautiful and vivacious, contrasted dramatically with her husband. While she shone with youth and health, Charles appeared as a pale shadow beside her, striving to maintain royal dignity. During the nuptial banquet, Catalina observed the pitying glances the French courtiers directed at the Spanish king. She also noted how some Spanish nobles were already positioning themselves for the inevitable succession conflict if Charles died without heirs. The wedding night was the subject of intense speculation. The next morning, rumors about the king's inability to consummate the marriage spread through the palace. Marie-Louise, educated in the sophisticated French court, now found herself trapped in a marriage with a man who could barely walk without aid and whose facial deformity made even kissing him difficult. As months passed, the absence of a pregnancy confirmed the court's fears. Marie-Louise, isolated in a foreign country with a sickly husband and a dominant mother-in-law, sank into melancholy. Charles, aware of his failure as a husband, increasingly took refuge in religion and hunting, one of the few physical activities he could perform. Catalina became confidant to both spouses, trying to mediate in a marriage doomed by biology. One afternoon, she found Marie-Louise crying in her chambers. "It is like being married to a corpse," sobbed the queen. "His body is cold, his breath smells of rot. When he fulfills his conjugal duties, it is as if death itself embraces me." "His Majesty is ill, madam, but he loves you sincerely," responded Catalina gently. "I know, and that makes it more painful. I do not blame him, but those who have turned him into what he is. Generations of marriages between relatives have created this. This being who cannot even chew properly because his jaws do not meet." The description was crude but accurate. Charles's prognathism was so severe that he had to swallow food almost whole, contributing to his constant digestive problems and the odor emanating from his mouth. The king is aware of his limitations, Majesty. Your support means much to him. Marie-Louise wiped her tears. I try, Catalina, but sometimes when we meet in private, his smell is as if the Habsburg family crypt has settled in his body, as if all his inbred ancestors are rotting inside him. The Queen was not far from the truth. The court physicians constantly battled the king's various ailments: epilepsy, digestive issues, general weakness, recurrent infections. Charles rarely passed a day without some medical crisis, and his body emanated odors that not even the strongest French perfumes could disguise. The situation worsened during balls and official receptions, where the contrast between the vigorous and beautiful French queen and her weak Spanish husband became evident to the entire court. On one occasion, during a ball in honor of the Austrian ambassador, Charles suffered an epileptic seizure while trying to dance with his wife. The odor that emanated from his body when servants removed him from the hall caused several ladies to faint. The princess who smelled like a crypt at the balls. The French courtiers began calling him in a cruel feminization that alluded to both his weakness and his infertility. Meanwhile, the European powers watched with growing interest the Spanish situation. The lack of a Habsburg heir would turn the succession to the Spanish throne into an international affair of the first order. France, Austria, Bavaria, and other royal houses with dynastic connections began preparing their claims. In 1689, after 10 years of childless marriage, Marie-Louise died suddenly. Rumors of poisoning spread quickly, pointing to Queen Mother Mariana or the Austrian party, interested in marrying Charles to a Habsburg archduchess who could continue the inbreeding tradition. Charles, devastated by the loss of his wife, fell into deep depression. His health problems worsened, and many at court doubted he would survive long. However, reasons of state prevailed. The royal council, dominated by the Austrian party, quickly arranged a new marriage for the king. This time, the chosen one was Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess from the House of Palatinate Neuburg. Catalina, who had known Charles since his childhood, watched with sadness as the last of the Spanish Habsburgs wasted away under the weight of his genetic heritage. The fragile but hopeful young man he had become a 30-year-old who looked 60, tormented by constant pains, unable to beget heirs, and aware that with him ended a dynasty that had dominated Europe for centuries. One night, while supervising preparations for the new queen's arrival, Catalina found Charles in the portrait gallery, the same place where years earlier they had discussed his spell. "I come here often," said the king with his nasal and labored voice. "I look at my ancestors and wonder if they knew what they were doing when they decided to marry among themselves again and again. They acted according to the customs of their time, Majesty. Medical science had not yet established the dangers of consanguinity. And now my new marriage has been arranged with a German princess, not a close relative. Do you think there is hope, Catalina? Will I be able to beget an heir and save the dynasty?" Catalina remained silent for a moment. As the king's confidant, she valued sincerity, but she also knew the medical reports describing Charles's deteriorated physical condition, including his probable sterility. "Hope must never be abandoned, Majesty, but perhaps you should also consider other possibilities for Spain's future." "You mean designating a successor outside the direct line? Spain and its empire will need a strong ruler if your Majesty has no descendants. The great powers are already preparing to claim the Spanish inheritance." Charles nodded gravely. Louis XIV for his grandson, Philip of Anjou. Emperor Leopold for his son, Archduke Charles. All vultures waiting for me to die to divide Spain's corpse. It does not have to be that way, Majesty. With a wise decision on your succession, you could ensure Spain remains united and strong. The king looked once more at the portraits of his ancestors, especially that of Philip II, the monarch who had consolidated the empire where the sun never set, and who had also been one of the main promoters of inbreeding marriages. The irony is that they intended to secure the continuity of their power, reflected Charles, and with their matrimonial decisions, they created the conditions for that power to be extinguished. I am the final result of their experiment, Catalina, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, incapable of begetting life, exhaling the smell of death at every ball, every audience, every moment of my existence. Catalina observed with compassion the man who, despite his limitations, had developed a profound understanding of his tragic historical situation. Charles II, the Bewitched, was in reality the victim of a centuries-old biological experiment, the final embodiment of a dynastic policy that had placed blood purity above the health of the succession line. Perhaps your legacy is not to continue the dynasty, suggested Catalina gently, but to make decisions that ensure a prosperous future for Spain, even under a new royal house. Charles looked at her with a spark of determination in his tired eyes. Then that will be my purpose in the years I have left, not to perpetuate my ancestors' error, but to correct it for the good of Spain and its people. As they left the gallery, the characteristic odor emanating from the king's body, that mix of putrefaction and illness that had led courtiers to compare him to a crypt, seemed to intensify, as if the ghosts of all the Habsburgs who had preceded him protested the idea that their last Spanish descendant recognized the failure of their grand dynastic experiment. Facing a choice that could ignite war across Europe, what would you do in Charles's place? Stick to family loyalty, or break free for the greater good? Madrid, November 1700. The royal Alcazar was plunged into an unsettling gloom. In his private chambers, Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, lay dying surrounded by powerless physicians, anxious courtiers, and priests murmuring prayers. At 39 years old, his body, worn out by diseases, had reached its limit. Catalina de Mendoza, now an elderly woman with white hair who had faithfully served 3 generations of the royal family, remained by the bedside holding the monarch's trembling hand. In the last weeks, Charles's deterioration had accelerated dramatically. Intestinal hemorrhages, convulsions, intermittent fevers. The odor emanating from his body was so intense that even the most experienced physicians had to cover their noses with handkerchiefs soaked in essences. "Catalina," whispered the king with a barely audible voice, "they are all outside." The elderly woman nodded and with a gesture made the last servants in the room leave. "We are alone, Majesty." Charles tried to sit up, but his weakness prevented it. His face, deformed by extreme mandibular prognathism, showed the ravages of a life of suffering and centuries of accumulated inbreeding. "The will is ready." "Yes, Majesty. Cardinal Portocarrero has it prepared according to your instructions." Charles closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "You know this decision will unleash a war." "Any decision you made would, Majesty. The European powers have been preparing for this moment for years." The king nodded slightly. During his second marriage to Mariana of Neuburg, it had become clear that he would not beget heirs either. The great royal houses of Europe, primarily the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs, had intensified their diplomatic maneuvers to position themselves before the imminent extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line. "I have decided to name as my successor Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV, murmured Charles. Catalina showed no surprise. She had witnessed the intense deliberations of recent months, the pressures from different factions, the legal and dynastic arguments put forward by each claimant. "The Austrians will not accept it easily," she commented. "Emperor Leopold believes his son, Archduke Charles, has more rights for being a Habsburg." "More rights and more risks," responded the king with bitterness. "Another branch of the same family, with the same blood problems. No, Catalina, Spain needs new blood, vigor, a radical change." A coughing fit interrupted his words. When he regained his breath, he continued, "Besides, I have imposed conditions. Philip must renounce any right to the French throne. The crowns of Spain and France can never unite. Spain must remain independent and its empire intact." Catalina knew these conditions were more a wish than a guarantee. Once Charles died, Spain's fate would be in the hands of foreign powers and their ambitions. "Do you remember our first conversation about the blood, Catalina? When I was a child, and you showed me the portraits of my ancestors." I remember, Majesty, you were very young, but you understood clearly the weight of your heritage. The weight and the curse, murmured Charles. Sometimes I think all the greatness of the Habsburgs, from Charles V to Philip II, was nothing but the prelude to this final farce I have become. The empire where the sun never set, reduced to a man who cannot even beget a child. You have not been a farce, Majesty, protested Catalina. You have ruled with dignity in impossible circumstances. The empire's decline began long before your birth. Charles sketched a sad smile, deformed by his prominent jaw. You are generous as always, but we both know the truth. I am the final result of a failed experiment, the point where the Habsburg inbreeding reached its biological limit. A new spasm of pain racked his body. The physicians had diagnosed a combination of ailments: hydrocephalus, renal failure, epilepsy, endocrine dysfunction, a catalogue of diseases reflecting the accumulation of genetic disorders after generations of consanguineous marriages. When the pain subsided, Charles fixed his gaze on Catalina. I want you to know that I understand what has happened. It was not a spell, as my mother said. It was the same blood mixed again and again until corrupted. Medical science is only beginning to understand these mechanisms, Majesty, but you and your father understood it decades ago. If they had listened to you, if my ancestors had sought wives outside the family. The matrimonial decisions of kings have always been political, Majesty. Your ancestors believed that by keeping Habsburg blood pure, they secured their power. And instead, they secured our extinction, completed Charles with bitterness. The irony is that my decision to name a Bourbon as heir is finally a recognition that new blood was necessary. Though it is too late for me, it will not be for Spain. At that moment, the door opened, and Cardinal Portocarrero entered with several members of the Council of State. Catalina stepped aside discreetly as the dignitaries approached the royal bed. Majesty, said the cardinal, bowing, the will is ready for your signature. With trembling hands, Charles took the pen offered to him. Before signing, he directed one last look at Catalina, as if seeking confirmation that he was doing the right thing. The elderly woman nodded imperceptibly. With a visible effort, the king affixed his signature to the document that would change Europe's destiny. Upon finishing, he dropped the pen and lay back exhausted. It is done, he murmured. May God protect Spain and its new king. The following days passed amid increasingly severe medical crises. On November 1st, 1700, after receiving the last sacraments, Charles II exhaled his final breath. With him died also the Spanish line of the House of Habsburg. The autopsy performed by the royal physicians confirmed what many suspected. The king's body presented multiple anomalies. The corpse had not a drop of blood. The heart appeared the size of a peppercorn, the lungs corroded, the intestines putrid and gangrenous, a single testicle black as coal, and the head full of water, recorded the medical report. The news of the king's death and the content of his will spread quickly through all European courts. As Charles had foreseen, reactions were immediate and belligerent. Emperor Leopold V rejected the will and claimed the rights of his son, Archduke Charles. Louis XIV, for his part, accepted the Spanish throne for his grandson Philip, but soon began acting as if Spain were already part of French domains, ignoring the conditions imposed in the will. In a few months, Europe was engulfed in the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would last 13 years and redesign the political map of the continent and colonial empires. While the powers prepared for war, Catalina de Mendoza, last confidant of the last Spanish Habsburg, retired to a convent in Toledo. There, during her final years, she wrote her memoirs, documenting not only the historical events she had witnessed, but also the medical observations her father had taught her about the effects of inbreeding in the House of Austria. History will remember Charles II as the bewitched, she wrote, but he was not the victim of any witchcraft, but of the arrogance of a dynasty that believed it could challenge the laws of nature indefinitely. For 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs practiced such extreme inbreeding that the last of them was born with a coefficient of consanguinity equivalent to that of a child of siblings. His blood, far from remaining pure, corrupted like wine that ferments too long until turning to vinegar. The mandibular prognathism that characterized the family intensified generation after generation until in Charles II it became so extreme that he could not even chew adequately. His body emanated odors of putrefaction even in life, as if all his inbred ancestors were decomposing inside him. At court balls, the princess who smelled like a crypt contrasted painfully with the vitality of his foreign wives. However, in his last years, Charles demonstrated surprising lucidity about his condition. He understood that courtly inbreeding had fermented flesh and reason for generations until reaching him, the end point of the experiment. And in an act of wisdom, he chose for Spain a different path, recognizing the need for new blood, though it was too late to save himself. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ended the War of Succession. Philip V, the Bourbon candidate, was recognized as King of Spain and the Indies, but the country lost its European possessions outside the peninsula: the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and Milan. The Spanish Empire, though reduced, survived under a new dynasty. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs, that fragile prince born under the sign of extreme inbreeding, had finally managed to break the cycle. Not by conceiving an heir, something his deteriorated biology had made impossible, but through a political decision that implicitly recognized the failure of his dynasty's inbreeding experiment. In the subsequent decades, medical science began to better understand the mechanisms of inheritance and the dangers of consanguinity. Marriages between close relatives, which had been common practice among European royalty, were gradually abandoned as their negative consequences became evident. The Spanish Bourbons, though not exempt from inbreeding practices, never reached the extreme levels of the Habsburgs. The infusion of new blood into the Spanish royal line brought a visible improvement in the health and vitality of the monarchs, confirming the intuitions that Catalina and her father had expressed decades earlier. The mandibular prognathism, that physical mark of the Habsburgs that had intensified generation after generation until reaching grotesque proportions in Charles II, gradually disappeared from the Spanish royal physiognomy. Portraits of the Bourbon kings showed more balanced faces, free of the deformity that had come to symbolize the biological decline of the previous dynasty. On her deathbed in the Toledo convent, Catalina de Mendoza reviewed her memoirs one last time. She had dedicated her life to serving a dynasty doomed by its own matrimonial policy and had witnessed the inevitable end of that centuries-old experiment. The lesson of the Spanish Habsburgs, she wrote in her final pages, is that not even the greatest power can challenge the laws of nature indefinitely. Blood that mixes with itself again and again eventually loses its vitality, like soil cultivated without rotation until exhausted. Charles II, the last and most affected of all, was also the most aware of this reality. In his moments of lucidity, he understood that he was the endpoint of a path his ancestors had traced with every inbreeding marriage. The princess who smelled like a crypt at the balls was not just a sick individual, but the symbol of a dynasty that had consumed itself. Perhaps his greatest legacy is not what he achieved in life, but his final recognition that change was necessary. By choosing a Bourbon as successor, Charles II implicitly admitted the failure of the Habsburg experiment and the need for new blood in Spain. Ironically, he whom they called the Bewitched was the one who finally broke the true spell, the belief that inbreeding preserved dynastic purity and power. With his death ended an era, but another began. Spain survived the Habsburgs, and medical science acquired, albeit belatedly, an invaluable lesson about the limits of human consanguinity. Catalina closed her diary and sealed it along with medical documents, letters, and genealogical records she had gathered over decades. She left instructions for this archive to be preserved in the convent, away from political intrigues, as testimony for future generations. A few days later, the elderly lady who had witnessed the twilight of the Spanish Habsburgs passed away in peace. Her archive remained hidden for centuries until modern researchers discovered it and confirmed with contemporary genetic advances what she had intuited: that the courtly inbreeding of the Habsburgs had fermented flesh and reason for generations until producing in Charles II a coefficient of consanguinity of 25.4%. equivalent to the offspring of a sibling marriage. The princess who smelled like a crypt at the balls had been the final act of a biological tragedy spanning 2 centuries of European history, and its end also marked the beginning of a new understanding about the consequences of defying the fundamental laws of human inheritance and reproduction.